The air was heavy that morning in Ouagadougou. Flags hung low. The sound of drums and muffled sobs echoed through the crowd as the coffin of 44-year-old Alino Faso returned home from Ivory Coast. Mothers wept. Old men stood silent, fists pressed against their chests. They had seen this scene before too many times. Another African voice silenced in a foreign cell. He had been accused of spying. But for millions across Burkina Faso, he was no spy. He was a patriot, a man who spoke about African unity, self-reliance, and the end of the begging bowl politics that have chained a continent for generations. And now his body was back, lifeless, scarred, and silent. When the news broke, President Ibrahim Traoré did not send condolences. He sent 3,000 soldiers. Armored trucks rolled south through the countryside, their engines humming like thunder beneath the Sahel sky. To the outside world, it looked like preparation for war. But inside Burkina Faso, it felt like justice, finally taking its own course. A message written not in diplomacy, but in dignity. You cannot kill one of us and expect silence again. Because for too long, African voices have been buried with apologies. For too long, sovereignty has been traded for aid and justice for convenience. But this time, the nation decided that grief would no longer mean surrender. So we ask you this: how many times can you kill an African voice before the continent finally answers back? And when that answer comes, will the world be ready to listen? Stay with us as we uncover the story behind Alino Faso's death, the 3,000 soldiers who marched for him, and the storm that may change Africa forever. Please share if you believe that Africa's voice can no longer be silenced. Subscribe if you believe that truth is more powerful than headlines. It began with whispers, not in embassies or war rooms, but in the markets, cafes, and crowded bus stations of Ouagadougou. A rumor spreading like dry wind through the Sahel: they killed Alino. For months, he had vanished after his arrest in Ivory Coast. The official reason: espionage and conspiracy. The unofficial truth: he had angered the wrong powers by speaking too boldly, too freely, too often. Alino Faso was no ordinary man. Born in Bobo Dioulasso, raised in dust and poverty, he became one of the most passionate digital voices of the Burkinabé youth. With nothing but an old smartphone, he transformed frustration into fire, calling for unity, dignity, and self-reliance. His words weren't perfect. Sometimes raw, sometimes reckless, but always real, and that authenticity gave him power. To the young, he was hope. To those who feared change, he was danger. In January 2025, he crossed into Ivory Coast for a media workshop and never came back. The Ivorian authorities accused him of being a spy. No trial, no evidence, just silence. 6 months later, in late July, the silence broke with death. Officials in Abidjan released a brief statement: Alino Faso had committed suicide in his cell. No witnesses, no photographs, no medical report. But across Burkina Faso, no one believed it. How does a political detainee die under 24-hour watch, people asked. How can a man who spoke every day for Africa suddenly choose silence? The next morning, the streets erupted. From downtown Ouagadougou to the villages of Koudougou and Kaya, thousands marched carrying red and green flags, the colors of revolution and resistance. They didn't chant for vengeance. They chanted for respect. You silenced a voice, one banner read, but not the people. And when the coffin draped in the national flag arrived from Abidjan, the entire country seemed to stop breathing. Motorbikes escorted the hearse, mothers held children on their shoulders, soldiers saluted as the body of a civilian passed. No state funeral could have captured the emotion of that day. It wasn't just grief, it was ignition. President Ibrahim Traoré watched quietly from the presidential compound. His first words came days later, calm but cold. They can kill the body of a Burkinabé, but they will never kill the soul of our independence. Those words were not poetry, they were orders. Behind closed doors, meetings began. Burkina Faso's intelligence reports linked Alino's detention to a network of exiled politicians, mercenaries, and NGO operatives operating from Ivorian soil, many with ties to Western donors and opposition groups. According to the files, they had coordinated disinformation and sabotage campaigns against Traoré's government since 2023. Now, with Alino's mysterious death, every suspicion found its proof. By early October 2025, the response was visible from space. Satellite images showed armored convoys moving south through Banfora Siniandu and Nyangoloko, three gateways to the Ivorian border. 3,000 soldiers disciplined and silent, forming what Ouagadougou called Operation Southern Shield. Officially, it was defensive. Symbolically, it was revolutionary. To the outside world, especially in Paris, Washington, and Brussels, it looked reckless, dangerous, even insane. But to the people of Burkina Faso, it was justice taking its own course. For decades, when African citizens were killed or humiliated abroad, their governments bowed and begged for explanation. This time, the youngest leader in the Sahel refused to bow. He didn't want revenge. He wanted respect. And in his defiance, millions found something they thought Africa had lost self-worth. In the streets, murals of Alino Faso began to appear, his eyes painted in bright red, his lips sealed by a chain, and beneath it the words, "You can't kill a revolution." Young people lit candles not for mourning, but for meaning. The message was clear. This was no longer about one man's death. It was about every African who had ever been silenced for speaking truth to power. And that was the turning point. The day Burkina Faso stopped being a nation in mourning and became a nation in motion. The day grief turned into doctrine and silence turned into strategy. When the first armored trucks reached Banfora, the world finally took notice. Their engines echoed across the plains, dust rising behind them like a warning to history itself. Cameras from international outlets zoomed in. Headlines flared, "Burkina Faso moves troops toward Ivory Coast." Commentators called it provocation. Western diplomats called it dangerous. But inside the country, it was something else entirely, a heartbeat returning to a nation that had been told to stay quiet. Operation Southern Shield had officially begun. 3,000 soldiers positioned across Banfora Siniandu and Nyangoloko, forming a southern wall of pride. They weren't told to attack. Their orders were simple: stand, watch, remind the world that our dignity has borders. And they did. In their eyes, this wasn't war. It was memory guarded by uniform. For years, Burkina Faso had been labeled fragile, unstable, poor. But on that October day, the nation looked anything but weak. The soldiers weren't just protecting territory, they were defending meaning. Each convoy became a declaration that sovereignty would no longer be theoretical. Back in Ouagadougou, the emotional tide was unstoppable. The same youth who had cried at Alino's funeral were now volunteering for community defense units. Pain had transformed into purpose. Posters reading "The South is not for sale," "The North has woken," "Burkina will stand," covered every wall. Even schools paused their lessons so students could attend civic gatherings about defending the revolution. Across the border, however, Abidjan was in shock. President Alassane Ouattara's administration issued calm statements: restraint, dialogue, mutual respect. But behind the polite tone was clear discomfort. For the first time in decades, a smaller landlocked country was challenging a coastal power long seen as the West's model of success. Officials called Burkina's move unjustified. They urged ECOWAS to intervene, hoping regional pressure would cool the flames. Yet every appeal from Abidjan seemed to harden Ouagadougou's resolve. Inside Burkina Faso's Defense Command, analysts were convinced this confrontation had been years in the making. Intelligence reports traced multiple subversive networks to Ivorian territory, remnants of the old elite ousted after Traore's rise. Some were former ministers, others were mercenaries working under NGO cover, and many had received consultancy funding from European sources. When Alino Faso was detained, the puzzle started to fit. When he died, the pieces locked in place. Traore saw it not as coincidence, but confirmation proof that foreign fingers were still reaching across borders. So he decided to draw a line not with ink, but with soldiers. As the troops settled into their new posts, social media across Africa exploded. Videos of Burkinabé convoys circulated with captions like, "Africa is waking up." From Mali to Niger, supporters of the ES alliance praised Traore's courage, calling it the first Pan-African act of deterrence. In Bamako, newspapers ran headlines reading, "Burkina defends what others only dream of." Meanwhile, Western analysts flooded talk shows warning of regional destabilization, the same term that for decades had been used to justify intervention. But this time, Africans weren't listening. For once, the narrative belonged to them. Inside Abidjan, panic simmered beneath official smiles. Economic circles feared border closures, supply shortages, and regional isolation. Ivory Coast's image as the island of stability was cracking, and whispers began that Ouattara's government had underestimated the young captain next door. Meanwhile, in Paris and Washington, statements came quickly, calls for de-escalation, concerns about authoritarian impulses. Yet none addressed the core issue: a Burkinabé citizen had died in Ivorian custody, and no one had been held accountable. To the global audience, this was geopolitics. To Africans, it was personal. Then came the moment that sealed the crisis. During a nationally televised address, Traore looked straight into the camera and said, "They told us to wait for justice, but justice delayed is submission disguised as peace." His words weren't shouted. They were measured, steady, and final, the tone of a man who had decided that apologies no longer feed the living. That night, the streets of Ouagadougou erupted again, not in protest, but in unity. Candles lit balconies, drums beat through neighborhoods, and the people whispered the same phrase again and again: "We are Alino." The following morning, a single drone shot captured a sea of Burkinabé flags fluttering across the capital. No Western military parade could match its sincerity, because what was unfolding wasn't just defiance. It was identity reborn the moment a nation decided that losing fear mattered more than losing favor. In the weeks that followed the troop deployment, Burkina Faso began to change in ways no one could have predicted. What started as outrage had become a reawakening. For the first time in years, the air in Ouagadougou carried something new: conviction. At every street corner, murals of Alino Faso appeared, painted by volunteers who had never met him but swore they knew his soul. His face, once seen on phone screens, now covered city walls, eyes, fierce mouth bound by chains beneath the words, "You can't kill the truth." Children asked their parents who he was, and the answer was always the same: he was one of us, and they silenced him for it. That story united a nation more than any policy ever could. Teachers turned classrooms into civic circles discussing the right to sovereignty. University students formed study groups on African media independence. Farmers' cooperatives renamed their markets after Alino. Even the military, often distant from civil life, began to open its barracks for community gatherings, a gesture unseen in modern African governance. And from that unity, something rare began to take root: trust. For decades, citizens had looked at their governments with skepticism, seeing only corruption and submission. But under Traore's leadership, the relationship was shifting. When soldiers drove through villages, people no longer hid, they waved. Because this time, the army wasn't fighting its own people. It was defending their dignity. Politically, the stakes were immense. Inside the National Assembly, debates turned fiery. Some lawmakers urged restraint, fearing sanctions and isolation. Others demanded escalation, arguing that peace without pride is slavery in disguise. But behind those words was something deeper: the realization that the country had crossed a psychological threshold. Burkina Faso would never again see itself as small. Across the Sahel, reactions were polarized. In Mali and Niger, pro-government marches celebrated what they called the Southern Stand, waving flags of the AES alliance, the triad of nations rewriting Africa's rules of power. In contrast, ECOWAS and Abidjan's allies accused Traore of destabilizing the region. But even their condemnations carried an undertone of anxiety, because if Burkina Faso could assert itself this boldly, what would stop others from following economically? The ripple effects were immediate. The border tensions disrupted trade routes between Bobo-Dioulasso and Abidjan, forcing Burkina Faso to redirect supplies through Mali and Ghana. Yet instead of panic, the government turned the disruption into a rallying call for economic self-reliance. Local industries received emergency support. The state launched a national campaign called "Produce What We Consume." Within weeks, new cooperatives formed across rural provinces to fill import gaps once covered by Ivorian goods. What foreign analysts predicted as economic collapse turned into a grassroots economic renaissance powered by necessity and pride. Meanwhile, the international response hardened. Paris and Brussels issued travel warnings. Washington warned of democratic backsliding. But in the hearts of ordinary Africans, none of that mattered. Because for the first time in decades, a government was not apologizing for protecting its citizens. It was apologizing for waiting so long to do it. And through it all, Traore remained silent. No grand speeches, no public parades, just the quiet certainty of a leader who knew that symbolism sometimes speaks louder than policy. In his silence, the people found their voice. By the end of October 2025, one phrase had become a national motto painted on buses' walls and even military vehicles: justice is not revenge, it's remembrance. And for Burkina Faso, for Africa, that remembrance had finally begun. While the streets of Ouagadougou filled with chants and color boardrooms, thousands of miles away filled with unease. In Washington, the headlines arrived with the same uneasiness that once followed the Arab Spring. Burkina Faso deploys troops to Ivory Coast, rising tensions in West Africa. But beneath those words, a quiet realization was spreading. Africa was no longer waiting for permission to act. For decades, the United States and its allies had treated West Africa as a classroom in need of supervision, funding elections, writing constitutions, and training soldiers, always under the banner of stability. But what happened in October 2025 broke that script. Here was a small, landlocked nation challenging a coastal economic giant, not on behalf of ideology or foreign patrons, but on behalf of its own citizens' dignity. And that made the Western establishment deeply uncomfortable. In press briefings, State Department officials called for dialogue, restraint, and respect for human rights. Yet the language felt hollow to many observers because for years the same voices had stayed silent when Western troops occupied African soil, when sanctions starved economies, or when African leaders were quietly replaced for defying multinational interests. Now that an African leader was standing firm, suddenly stability mattered again. In Paris, panic came in quieter tones. French analysts on late-night TV warned that Traoré's nationalism could inspire an uncontrollable chain reaction. They were right, but not in the way they feared. From Mali to Niger, from Guinea to Chad, people began to ask the same question. If Burkina Faso can defend its sovereignty, why can't we? Across Europe, the framing was predictable. Editorials painted Ibrahim Traoré as a populist, a military strongman, a threat to democratic order. Yet few mentioned why the confrontation began: the death of a civilian, Alino Faso, in a foreign cell. It was easier to debate geopolitics than to confront the moral wound at the heart of it. Even in the United Nations, the tone was cautious. African delegations split down the middle. Some, aligned with Western donors, condemned Burkina Faso's aggressive posture. Others praised Traoré's courage, calling it a moral stand for African dignity. Behind closed doors, diplomats admitted what public statements could not: that the balance of influence in Africa was shifting away from New York and Brussels and toward Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. In the Global South, reactions were far more sympathetic. Countries like India, Venezuela, and Cuba voiced support for Burkina Faso's right to self-defense. On African social media, hashtags like #NachaWereAlino and #AfricaWakes trended for weeks. Even commentators in the African diaspora in Atlanta, London, and Kingston saw the story as part of a larger awakening. For many Americans watching from afar, the crisis raised uncomfortable reflections. What does freedom mean if it's only celebrated when it aligns with Western interests? And what happens when those same ideals, independence, self-determination, dignity, are claimed by nations long treated as dependent? In the end, the world's reaction said more about its fears than about Traoré's actions. Because what shook Washington and Paris wasn't the sight of tanks or soldiers. It was the sight of an African nation refusing to kneel, and doing it not with anger, but with conviction. And for the first time in decades, the question wasn't whether Africa could rise. It was whether the world was ready to face an Africa that already had. The dust over the southern border has not settled, but something deeper has. A shift, quiet, moral, irreversible, has taken place inside the African mind. The death of Alino Faso may have begun as a tragedy, but it has ended as a testament. His voice, silenced in a foreign cell, has become an echo carried by millions. Across villages and cities, people whisper his name not in sorrow, but in pride. He died for dignity. And through him, Burkina Faso discovered what every empire has always feared: that once a people find meaning in their suffering, they become unstoppable. Under Ibrahim Traoré, that meaning has turned into motion. The deployment of 3,000 soldiers was never just a military act. It was a declaration that the era of African obedience is over. That sovereignty no longer means asking for protection, but building it. That freedom is not given, it is taken and defended. But every awakening carries danger. As Burkina Faso rises, so do the shadows that wish to see it fall. Sanctions, economic isolation, even orchestrated coups, these are the old tools of a nervous world order. The same pattern that once crushed revolutions in Ghana, in Congo, in Libya. And yet this generation seems different. They have seen what dependence costs, and they are willing to pay the higher price of freedom. Still, one question remains the same one that now echoes far beyond Ouagadougou. Can Africa defend its dignity without being punished for it? And how far will the world go to keep an obedient Africa alive? Because what is unfolding in Burkina Faso is no longer a local crisis. It is a mirror reflecting every choice the world has made about who deserves respect and who deserves restraint. And if history has taught us anything, it's that dignity once awakened never sleeps again. So tonight, as we watch a small nation stand its ground against a system built to humble it, perhaps the question we should be asking isn't whether Ibrahim Traoré is being too bold, but whether the rest of us have been too silent. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's stand for sovereignty is worth the risk of global isolation? Or should Africa still compromise to survive in a world that only respects power? Share your thoughts below, because the story of Alino Faso isn't just about one man or one nation. It's about all of us, anyone who still believes that truth once spoken should never be buried. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré's vision for a dignified Africa. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines.